of Orlando, Florida. You are listening to the most electrifying show in media, A Neighbor's Choice. And I am your neighbor, once again here in beautiful Central Florida for another exciting journey. A journey through the topics that you just don't hear on the daily TV news cycle. But these are the topics that really excite everyone, our neighbors, because we deal with the problems that really make us all think real late into the night. You know, the questions of, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be conscious? I'm conscious right now.
Yes.
Are you? I have my friend, Chief Science Officer Dr. Yu in the house.
Yes. I'm so excited, looking forward for this show. So we're going to solve one of the biggest mystery in the universe.
Yes, that's right.
The origin, the mystery, the origin of consciousness.
The origin of consciousness. That's the theme of today's subject matter. And yeah, we could talk about Mueller for about, an hour and just talk about how wonderful his hair is and how wonderful he is for democracy and what he did for, stopping Saudi Arabia and all that. But instead, we're going to deal with something that we always wonder about. Why are we here? What does it mean to be a conscious being in this universe? And I have to tell you, I am privileged because today, your humble host, just a radio host here in Orlando, is not only does he have a rocket scientist, but we've also got a brain surgeon in the house, Dr. Eben Alexander, author of many best-selling books, including Proof of Heaven and Living in a Mindful Universe. Dr. Eben Alexander, thank you for being on the program.
Well, David, it's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me on.
Now, I have to tell you, I remember reading your book almost 6 years ago in Venice with my wife, and that was a wonderful experience. I remember sitting in a beautiful what are those things, those little boats, gondolas or whatever?
The gondola.
Yeah,
right.
and I was reading your book in between our wonderful time, and I said, man, this is a wonderful book. And ironically enough, I was there for a friend of ours who is a neuroscientist as well, and he had a conference in Venice. But I had great memories of that book because
perfect.
Of how great
how
that was.
How appropriate. Well, I'm glad you had that book to read right at that conference.
Yeah. And, I'm my chief science advisor for all things A Neighbor's Choices with this Dr. Wei-Ping Yu. He's a theoretical physicist and aerospace engineer at Kennedy Space Center. And he's thrilled to be able to speak with you. This is going to be a lot of fun.
Well, good. Well, I'm glad he's here, too. I love having some of the scientific discussions about all this. And, of course, the physics community is way out front in terms of a lot of this discussion, even though the nature of consciousness remains a very profound mystery. But it certainly has a lot to do with physics and our interpretation of physics.
Right. And Dr. Yu, he kind of slays some of the sacred cows of physics. He thinks that, quantum physics doesn't quite have it figured out. He has his own ideas, and so we'll try to interlace those in as we go. But we want this to be a program that covers a lot of topics because that's what you've done in your career. You're a distinguished neurosurgeon. You've worked at Harvard Medical. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, basically, I had grown up in a neurosurgical family. My father was a globally renowned neurosurgeon. He was the chairman of the program at Wake Forest University in North Carolina. And so I grew up with a very scientific background, but he was also very religious. I mean, he believed in a loving personal God and the power of prayer, and in fact, that was something important to him in his neurosurgical work. So even though he was training people to be world-leading neurosurgeons, he also had plenty of room for a very deep but kind of spiritual reality in his life. And so much of my life has been spent trying to reconcile those two features, because I started my life very much believing that science is the pathway to truth, but then I subscribed heavily in my training at Duke Medical Center, where I got my MD in 1980 and did my residency work ending in 1987. Then I worked at Harvard Medical School for more than 15 years teaching neurosurgery. So it was always a very scientific approach, and yet what we've found in terms of the nature of consciousness is that it doesn't simply just behave by the rules one would expect from a materialist perspective. That is the notion that the physical world is all that exists, and therefore the brain must somehow produce consciousness. In fact, that form of analysis has never gotten anywhere. And we can talk all about that, but consciousness is not created by the brain. That's one of the biggest mistakes and smoke and mirrors tricks of 20th century and early 21st century science to try and perpetrate that myth. But it is not true, and that's where consciousness studies now are getting so fascinating in terms of where they're leading.
Dr. Alexander, okay, I agree with you on the point that you mentioned about in your video. Say current science is very simplistic. It offers nothing at all about the consciousness.
Right.
I agree with
it. It really doesn't.
That's a deficiency of the current physics, and that's why. So I developed something new theory to cover that.
I look forward to hearing about that.
Okay.
Well, now what happened now for those who, you ended up, here you are a neurosurgeon, you've done this, it's in your history or your family, but then you find yourself on Dr. Oz and Oprah and all these shows, and now the most electrifying show in media. What happened on this whirlwind tour that you just... what happened? Tell us the incident.
Well, first of all, I want to point out to you that I'm celebrating a 10th anniversary of coming out of coma. I came out of coma on November 16th, so, we're 4 days beyond that anniversary, 10 years ago in 2008. So what did happen to me is, as I describe in the book Proof of Heaven, is I was driven very rapidly into coma on the morning of November 10th of 2008. Within about 3.5 hours, I went from symptom onset of back pain and headache to having grand mal seizures, being deep in coma, where I would be for the next 7 days. And, the story that I gleaned from family and friends, doctors and nurses who took care of me filled in the gaps because I knew nothing of that week. I was gone from this world for that week. But what I found was they quickly determined that I might have meningitis, did a lumbar puncture, and out came thick white pus under pressure. That's when they put me on 3 powerful intravenous antibiotics for treating a gram-negative bacterial meningitis and put me on a ventilator up on the medical ICU, and that's where I was for the next 7 days. The beginning of that week, they estimated I had a 10% chance of survival. By the end of the week, when I really had not responded very well to those antibiotics, and they'd seen no sign of a neurologic turnaround from a very deep coma, that's when they were recommending that they said basically I'd gone from a 10% chance of survival over that week down to a 2% chance, and that there was no real chance of recovery. Even if I was in that 2% survivor category, I would just be stuck in a nursing home for a few months where I'd finally succumb to the illness. And that's why my doctors recommended stopping antibiotics. Now, it's a few hours after that I came back to this world, but my doctors were right. My brain was absolutely wrecked. When I came back to this world, I did not even recognize loved ones at the bedside. I didn't even have words or language. None of my memories of Eben Alexander's life before coma were still there. All I knew was where I'd been deep in coma, that extraordinary journey that really most neuroscientists would admit, given the medical facts of my medical record and the damage to my neocortex with all 8 lobes of my brain affected by this, there should have been no way to have any kind of hallucination or dream or drug effect or confabulation, because some part of the neocortex would have to be working for that to occur. And yet my doctors had perfect evidence from that week that my neocortex and my brainstem were both very badly damaged, even on day 1 of that coma. And in fact, for those interested in my medical records, those have recently been summarized in a case report that came out in September of 2018 in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases. It's a 4-page case report, but it makes it very clear that my brain was very damaged and would not be expected to support any kind of conscious awareness, much less the ultra-real reality that I did experience.
Okay.
And not only that, they surmised in that case report that my extraordinary survival, which, of course, any doctor who reads my medical records is going to be shocked that I can come out of all that and be at all intact. I mean, I should have just been a wreck. That's where almost all those cases end up. And yet, the people who wrote the case report, 3 independent physicians, surmised that my miraculous recovery could be at least partially due to the fact that I had this extraordinary spiritual experience that I report in Proof of Heaven. And that's why I think all of this kind of story and these kind of experiences are important to all of us, because they have everything to do with our possibilities for healing and for physical, mental, emotional, and especially spiritual health.
That's fascinating. And I'm gonna have Dr. Yu ask you a question, and then we're gonna go on the other side of a commercial break to find your answer.
Okay,
All
Dr.
right.
Alexander. So during your 7 days in coma, so your neocortex, being shut down, seriously damaged. So what about your body temperature? What about and what about consciousness not only exists in the heart, in the brain, it has in the heart, and actually exists in every single cell. So are your body still in the same temperature as normal people?
Well, I don't know how much I'm supposed to wait till after a commercial break, but I started out with a fever and a very high white count of more than 23,000, which is about 2.5 times normal, and a fever that was kind of hard to bring down, but they did keep the fever controlled during most of the week after that initial presentation.
What about the brain waves?
Well, we'll hold on for a second. We'll be right back on the other side.
We'll come back and answer about the brainwaves.
You're listening to A Neighbor's Choice. I'm David Gornoski. We'll see you in a second. A Neighbor's Choice Radio is back, and I am your host, David Gornoski, here with Dr. Yu, Chief Science Advisor. The problems we have, they're so easy to solve. You don't need a rocket scientist, but we brought one just in case tonight. And we also have a brain surgeon. So between the two of them, I think we're going to solve everything, okay?
I hope we've got it covered.
Well, on the other side, we were talking about, your experiences. We're speaking with Dr. Eben Alexander. He's the author of Proof of Heaven and Living in a Mindful Universe. And he's got a lot of insights into consciousness as a neurosurgeon and as someone who was once a skeptic of consciousness being separated from materialism. And now he's had this breakthrough because of a near-death experience. On the other side, I wanted to ask, what is your definition of consciousness? Let's start with fundamentals.
Well, I would just say that consciousness is the awareness of existence. Just the, as Rene Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. So it's this kind of unusual quality of our thinking and our perceptions of the universe that we have this awareness of existing. And that is what I would say is consciousness. But it starts to get very interesting as you follow down that rabbit hole, because what I've come to realize is that no human being has ever witnessed anything other than the inside of their own consciousness. And we need to come to a much deeper understanding of the relationship between brain and mind to even begin to make sense of what it means to be a human being and why this universe might exist and why we're here. So it's all fascinating material. Far more than I ever would have realized before my coma, when I kept thinking along the lines of what's called promissory materialism, which is just that, in the world of neuroscience, we keep thinking if we keep studying the brain more and more, sooner or later we'll come up with an explanation for consciousness. But in point of fact, that line of reasoning has never worked, and there have been many neuroscientists along the way that have come to realize that materialism is false, that the brain is not the producer of consciousness at all. And I would say now that developments in all of kind of modern consciousness studies are picking up speed very rapidly to leave materialism behind as a hopelessly lost and wrong worldview of understanding how all this works.
Dr. Yu, did you have a question?
Yes, I do. Dr. Alexander, excellent definition about consciousness is the awareness of existence, include self-awareness and awareness of environment. Okay.
Right.
So now I have a question for you. What mechanism make you aware the existence?
Well, I would say that awareness is the thing we're trying to define, and the awareness of existence is something that when you really get down and start studying the kind of brass tacks of the relationship between brain and mind, for example, as Wilder Penfield did, as one of the most renowned neurosurgeons of the 20th century. He worked in Montreal and spent more than 3 decades of his life resecting abnormal tissue in people with epileptic seizures, trying to control their seizures. And he wrote a book based on all of his experience, given that he was electrically stimulating the brain in awake patients. The book came out in 1975. It's called The Mystery of the Mind, and he makes it very clear in there that even though he's right at the interface between brain and kind of phenomenology of brain, that is the electrical stimulation and what people experience when their brain is so stimulated. And he came to the conclusion as a very rigorous scientist that you're not going to explain the workings of mind or of free will and even of memory as being resident in the physical brain itself. And I would say that his findings were very sound in 1975, but the world was really not ready for that at that time. But converging lines of evidence, both in quantum physics and trying to understand the measurement paradox and contextuality, with more and more refined experiments over the last few decades, converging with notions in neuroscience, which is that you're not going to find consciousness, and in fact, even memory is not something you're going to find stored in the physical brain. So we're really getting to a point very rapidly from both the physics and from the neuroscience of consciousness and phenomenology of the mind that consciousness is something that is primordial and is allowed in by the filtering mechanism of the brain, but it is not produced by the brain itself.
And we're speaking with Dr. Eben Alexander, best-selling author of Proof of Heaven, then Living in a Mindful Universe. And you went through a near-death experience that changed your mind about consciousness, that consciousness is not a product of the brain. It's something more than that. And that's what we're exploring here tonight on A Neighbor's Choice. Dr. Yu has this view that every particle in the body is magnetic. Dr. Yu, any...
Okay. Dr. Alexander, my research come out the consciousness through. I ask you about the mechanism, about how can we aware, how can human biological body aware self and aware environment through only one thing. That's my discovery. Magnetism.
I'd like to hear more about that.
Wow, I like that. I know your partner Karen. I listened to one video. I knew if Karen's here, she would be very happy about it. Okay, so
go on. Tell us more.
Okay, so the key is here. Remember, the current physics believe every single particles are dead mechanical balls, or say points. That I find that's where disconnected with the real world. What I discovered is every single matters not only have a mass, the key point it has consciousness. Through what? Is magnetism. Every single matter has magnetism. The magnetism, that's the force, can feel, can remote sensing, remote feeling. That's magnetic force. That's where arises consciousness. And because of this one, I notice you emphasize a very important point to say consciousness are not a local phenomenon. Can be global, and we are all connected. You know what? That's one of my discoveries too. So we all go through, connected through magnetic field. That's the secret in quantum mechanics too.
I certainly agree that we are all connected. I think we're connected with that kind
field,
of self-awareness
that's
of
conscious.
The universe.
Yes.
We're connected through the one mind.
One mind. That's one mind is the mechanism carry the mind. The mind is nothing more just a vibration, just signal the different frequency, different amplitude, signal of vibration of this magnetic field. Magnetic fields are universal because this is everywhere.
Well, it all sounds very interesting. I'm not, I'm familiar with concepts of what's known as panpsychism, which is, as physicists have studied and neuroscientists have studied brain and mind and the nature of reality, we get to a point where we realize you cannot reduce consciousness to the physical workings of the brain alone. And I
think
think
true.
Most people have pretty much agreed on that for decades, although there's still some holdouts who keep believing that if you study the brain hard enough, you're going to find all the mechanisms for consciousness and memory and every bit of it. This is something we go into in a lot of detail in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, is how that is not really the way this is going to play out. Even something like memory, which many neuroscientists still think must reside in the brain because they are physicalists at heart. They believe that the physical universe is all that exists, and yet we come to realize that that is not the case. So most people end up adopting some form of dualism. That is, they realize you cannot fully reduce the workings of the mind down and explain it completely through workings of brain. Therefore, there's got to be, the physical stuff making up the brain, but also mental stuff, substance or something in this universe. And so the simplest kind of materialist way to treat that is to assume that the properties of consciousness come in these little proto-conscious forms that come with all the subatomic particles and atoms, and that somehow then you can dismiss this notion of trying to explain consciousness as separate because you've already included that in your materialist model. But for many reasons, which we go into in detail in Living in a Mindful Universe, from the point of view of humans living human lives, especially with all the evidence there is for non-local consciousness, and that in fact there's tremendous scientific evidence for things like reincarnation, showing that we can have memory from life to life, even though we don't have an intervening physical body to maintain that. It all points, from my point of view, to a much bigger interpretation of the mind-brain relationship, which is not just some form of dualism, but actually goes all the way to idealism, looking at this as a mental universe where basically the orderings in a mental space are what determine the events that occur in human lives. So in other words, you cannot explain it from a bottom-up physics approach of, the physics of subatomic particles, atoms, molecules, and cells of the brain, all giving us this illusion of consciousness. But you need a bigger model, and that's the one that we argue for in our book, and that is of idealism, where mental properties are what control in a top-down fashion all the working of the universe. And I'd say this is certainly a model that's consistent with some of the emerging thinking about quantum physics. For example, Richard Kahn Henry, the head of astrophysics at Johns Hopkins University, wrote a beautiful one-page essay in Nature, in the journal Nature in 2005, called Mental Universe, where he explained very clearly how quantum physics was getting to a point where the best way to interpret the information is that there's a top-down ordering of causality that operates throughout the entire universe. So, in fact, our physical universe is a projection out of the mental. And this is where I think we really need to go to be explaining anything about the nature of consciousness, and especially the modern studies in psychology and in parapsychology and in scientific studies in general, showing that consciousness is much bigger than something that can be explained by just physical brain, and that our incarnations are actually just a small part of our overall existence as souls in this world.
Fascinating. We're talking with Dr. Eben Alexander, author of Proof of Heaven and Living in a Mindful Universe. And Eben experienced a near-death experience that radically altered his perspective on life after death. So on the other side of this break, I want to ask you, what do you think is the best piece of evidence from your experience for life after death? You're listening to A Neighbor's Choice. I'm David Gornoski. We'll see you in a second. And welcome back to A Neighbor's Choice Radio, the show that wakes you up from your sleep, the show that doesn't want you relying on all those pretty little TV programs to fill your information with things that lead nowhere. I'm your host, David Gornoski, and I'm speaking with two great friends of mine, Dr. Yu, who is a theoretical physicist, aerospace engineer over at NASA, and my chief science advisor for slaying sacred cows that are propped up by crony capitalism of science, these old, stinky, outdated ideas, and then also a wonderful neurosurgeon and a star for advancing the principle of consciousness as a real effect in society and a real principle of reality, Dr. Eben Alexander. I have him with me as well. And I wanted to ask you, Dr. Alexander, what do you think in your mind was the best piece of evidence for the most skeptical person who's a diehard materialist like a Richard Dawkins or something? What would be your best piece of evidence from your near-death experience for the fact that it was something outside of matter, that it was proof of heaven or life after death?
Well, I think the best thing to do, I mentioned to your listeners a short while ago that there was a case report reviewing my medical records, coming to some pretty amazing conclusions. That case report just came out last month in Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases, but it's accessible to anybody. If you go to my website, that is ebenalexander.com, click on blog and look at not my most recent blog that came out yesterday, or came out Friday, but the blog before that, where I talk about the medical data confirming the validating facts about my case, and you can get all the medical data there you need. But most importantly, to answer your question, is the doctors who reviewed those medical records noted that the vast majority of my coma experience, of my near-death experience, had to happen between days 1 and 5 of coma. There are many reasons for that. I go into them in book Proof of Heaven, and also in our most recent book, Living in a Mindful Universe. But anyway, those facts are there that kind of put the vast majority of my coma experience between days 1 and 5 of a 7-day coma. And of note, the doctors record that my Glasgow Coma Scale, which is widely used around this world to measure how deep someone is in coma. And that scale, for any of your average listeners, would be 15 for most of them because they're normal waking people. So that gives you a GCS, Glasgow Coma Scale of 15. Anything below 9 is deep in coma. And if you get down to 3, you're a corpse. So it turns out that my Glasgow Coma Scale, during that time, days 1 to 5, when my NDE had to happen, my Glasgow Coma Scale was 6 or 7. Some of the references put it as low as 5. I know that my oculocardiac reflex was gone. That's one of the very most primitive and last things to go, and the fact that that was gone, too, is a very bad sign in trying to interpret a low GCS score. But what all it points out, especially given that the CT and MRI scans showed that my bacterial meningoencephalitis affected all 8 lobes of my brain, is there's no good place left for any kind of conscious experience to happen, given the role that modern neuroscience places on the neocortex for putting together all of the detailed specifics of any kind of conscious awareness in the moment. Every bit of that depends on some part of the neocortex being functional. And yet my doctors had very good evidence that mine was gone. And to me, the biggest surprise when I came back to this world and all my memories were absolutely eradicated, all I knew was where I'd been deep in coma. And then it was over 2 months or so that I had a return of all those prior memories, recognizing the loved ones at the bedside by the second and third day, coming out of coma, things like that. But then all my semantic knowledge, all my knowledge of cosmology, physics, neuroscience coming back literally completely over about 2 months. That part was a tremendous surprise. And what the whole journey showed me very clearly is, for one thing, memories are not physically stored in the brain. which is something that Penfield suspected and stated as much as he could for as far as he had gone. The evidence is much stronger now. So the memories came back from somewhere, and of course that was a big mystery for a long time. But really, I think the most important thing is that the neurologic exams and the CT and MRI scans, plus the lab data, all available in the case report that you can access through my blog posting, really make it impossible that I could have had anything more than the most rudimentary of little minimal trickles of consciousness. And yet what I experienced was the exact opposite. It was way too real to be real. Now, of course, the other thing to point out here for your listeners is you will never prove the reality of the afterlife from near-death experiences alone. And the reason is that near-death experiencers don't die. Mm-hmm. Now, that doesn't take away from the fact that these experiences are very profound, and really there should be no way that they can occur if you buy into a materialist model of brain creates consciousness, especially in some of these people who've had very badly damaged brains and yet had these incredible experiences, like in my case. So what I'm saying is, as a neurosurgeon, I realized in the months after my coma, as I began realizing the depth of the problem I faced and trying to understand it all, I also came to know that the only way to come to a deep explanation about near-death experiences and what they tell us about consciousness and about the nature of reality is to have a much bigger picture of consciousness itself. And that's why I was very elated to find that there are scientists around the world who've been studying consciousness from all possible angles and are coming to these very same conclusions. In fact, I was just in a meeting presenting some of my work in London last week. I was over there with my life partner and co-author, Karen Newell. She helped write the book, Living in a Mindful Universe. We were presenting some of our work in London, and it all coincided because I'm an advisor, one of more than 100 scientists advising a group called the Galileo Commission. And your listeners who are interested should check out GalileoCommission.org, and we'll find the report of that group. But it's basically more than 100 scientists, including myself, who realize that consciousness is not created by the brain, that the physicalist model that only the physical world exists is false, and that therefore we need a much bigger model, a scientific model of reality, just to explain the workings of mind and brain and how they interrelate. But it's really understanding the depths of what any human being has ever experienced is only what we call the supreme illusion. It's a model within mind that we assume is a faithful representation of a reality that is out there. But quantum physics is very busy trying to prove to us that there's no such thing as an objective physical universe independent of the mind of the observer. And that is what is so important for people to get, because essentially what it means is when the brain and body die, you're not getting rid of the mind, you're actually liberating it from the shackles of the prison. And that's what near-death experiencers have been describing for thousands of years, is that liberation from the shackles of the physical brain and the physical world as the world we live in, because, in fact, our consciousness is not dependent on it at all.
Now, you met someone in your near-death experience. It was a little girl, right? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I did, and, of course, this is a spoiler alert for any who have not yet read Proof of Heaven, because it's really how the whole book comes together in the end. It's a very powerful piece of information that, to me, kind of forced me to rethink everything, because the first 4 months after my coma, I was blown away by how real it was, but I was also surprised that my father wasn't present, because first of all, I wrote down all my near-death experience that I could remember before I read anything about anybody else's near-death experience. And this was the advice of my older son, Eben IV, who was majoring in neuroscience in college at the time I went into coma. And he came home, when I was surprised of all to him and everybody else that I was coming back to this world. And he came home to be with me for Thanksgiving 2 days after I got out of the hospital back in 2008. That's when I told him it was way too real to be real, and therefore I was trying to explain it all as some vast hallucination, but I was just beginning to research my own medical records to figure out how such a vast hallucination might have happened. Of course, when I finished reviewing those records, I I knew that a vast hallucination could not have happened. In fact, that's what the medical record showed, and that's what's included in that medical case report that is also making the point that, the spiritual qualities of an NDE have miraculous healing properties, so we should pay big attention to them. But in essence, I think the whole thing was having to have a much bigger understanding of the nature of consciousness and how the brain relates with consciousness, and that's what I was being driven towards as I was investigating my own case and coming to realize that all of my prior thinking from neuroscience and philosophy of mind failed in explaining this experience. And yet near-death experiencers have been talking about the ultra-reality of that realm, that it's far more real than this world for thousands of years.
We're speaking with Dr. Eben Alexander, and on the other side, I wanted to maybe you give us a little bit more about that little girl you met and some of the other things you experienced in this near-death experience. I think it's good to put, these little pieces into the story to make sense of how profound this was for you on a human experience and not just as a neuroscientist. And so we'll talk to that. We'll ask that question on the other side. What was that little girl? Who was that little girl? I want to know more about that. You're listening to David Gornoski. I'm the host of A Neighbor's Choice, and we'll see you in a second.
Hi, this is David Gornoski, founder of A Neighbor's Choice. A Neighbor's Choice is sponsored by people just like you, making weekly or monthly contributions to support the development of this show, which is dedicated to introducing Jesus' personhood revolution to the broader public. Visit www.aneighborschoice.com, click on Contribute, and start your monthly pledge today. We appreciate your support.
And welcome back. Welcome to A Neighbor's Choice Radio. I'm your host, David Gornoski, in our final segment. And wow, it's been a fascinating roller coaster of another show. I've got Dr. Yu, my physicist friend, here in studio with me. And I'm also speaking with Dr. Eben Alexander, author of Proof of Heaven, and also a new book, Living in a Mindful Universe. And you are all about trying to explain consciousness to people. And there's a lot of mystery to this. And frankly, I want people to understand that I think, the world would be a better place if we could get over our fear of death and dying. There's a latent subconscious death anxiety that kind of rules so much of what human beings are doing to each other on an unconscious level. You'll meet people and they'll say, oh, I have no fear of death. I'm perfectly fine. I'm just, stealing trillions of dollars to give to my military friends for the military. I'm just perfectly fine. Yeah. No, it's not. There's so many problems that people go to war over. They loot economies. They're putting people in cages. We have people on the show all the time that are in prison for nonviolent, victimless behaviors. And we just see so much aggression and needless ritual sacrifice that I think ultimately is rooted in a kind of denial of death, as Ernest Becker would say, or something like a fear of what's going to happen on the other side. The idea that we have this implicit fear that we have a finite time on this earth and we have to squeeze the most out of it and take advantage of people and exploit people. And I think the idea that you're trying to introduce, which is important, is that consciousness is not wholly in of the brain and of matter, that it is outside, and that I put it this way. If you had a child who, when they're an infant, right, and they fight going to sleep, they fight going to sleep because there's a fear of what that effect of sleeping is for a little child that doesn't know what that's like. They want to stay awake. And so they scream sometimes in that little process of nighttime. But I think humanity is like a baby. It's like an infant. And we're struggling and we're fighting and we're killing each other because unconsciously we know that we feel like, we have a finite time, and therefore we're wrestling with going to sleep, so to speak, as an infant species. And if we grew up, if we could come to a knowledge of surety that just as an older child knows, when I go to sleep, I don't think a thing about it. I don't scream and pout. I just go to sleep and I wake up and I know there's another morning. If we could all know that as a species, I think we could go to another level of getting along without doing all these crazy things to each other.
Well, David, I think you bring up some excellent points. And what I would say first and foremost is the deepest and most profound lesson of near-death experiences. And they've been around for thousands of years. Every single culture, every belief system, every ethnic group, everybody has near-death experiences going back at least 2,400 years in recorded history. And the thing that is the deepest and most profound lesson is that we have souls. We're all connected through this primordial mind, and we're really here to be here for each other. You know, one of the biggest sicknesses of that materialist focus that you were referring to minutes ago is we get addicted to all these physical things, and we start trying to fill, the needs of our kind of eternal spiritual existence with physical stuff. That's where addiction and alcoholism, all those things come into play, because we're basically trying to fill kind of emotional and spiritual holes or vacuums with material stuff, and it just doesn't work. The most fundamental lesson that comes back, if you talk to thousands of near-death experiencers, as I have, is that we are here to make all of the choices in our lives, choices with ourselves and with others, out of love, compassion, kindness, forgiveness, and mercy. These are important qualities that somehow get lost in our materialist, me-focused world. In fact, we're in deep trouble. If you look at actuarial curves, that is the life expectancy of people in the United States, those curves have been improving. You know, we've been getting to longer ages as we go with all the modern developments in society, except now those curves are starting to go down again. And it's not because we have a worsening in the usual suspects like heart disease, strokes, and cancer. What's happening is the opioid crisis and the suicide epidemic together are depressing our actuarial survival to where it's looking worse now for all Americans. And I would say that the opioid crisis and the suicide epidemic are right at the heart of the problem with materialist, secular, kind of nihilistic thinking about our reason for existence and the fact that we're all together. I often talk about the work that we do, and people can learn more if you go to EbenAlexander.com, or if you want to learn more about the meditation that we recommend, the differential frequency brain entrainment, I would steer you to sacredacoustics.com. But those sites are a wealth of information for people who want to learn more about all this, about this revolution in consciousness, this kind of proof of the reality of the soul, that kind of our journeys here are much more understandable when we realize we've had other incarnations before. The scientific evidence for reincarnation is very strong out of the University of Virginia.
Dr. Alexander, we're going to have to cut it off here. We're going to have to do another show with you, maybe an online-only special for those that we can have Dr. You and you interact and flesh out these ideas more, because it's fascinating, and I thank you for your time.
I'm sorry I've kind of over-talked.
Oh, no, it's wonderful. We've had a great time. We'll have everybody together again. Thanks. You're listening to A Neighbor's Choice Radio. I'm David Gornoski, and remember, your positive thoughts have an influence on your reality.